So, dear colleagues, it's the fourth Saturday of another month, and it's my pleasure today to invite all of you to the 11th session of Medanta Econ Cardiology today and tomorrow. This is the 11th session which we do, and I thank all the attendees and senior people for their presence in the session and enriching us with their comments, queries, and good suggestions. In keeping with the changing world, the today's session is appropriately titled Complex Cases in Echocardiography, Valvular Heart Disease. As you know, echocardiography has evolved to that extent that the very backbone of the diagnosis of structural heart disease is actually echocardiography. And in keeping with this, today's environment, today's thinking, and the power of echocardiography, the topics today are complex cases in echocardiography, valvular heart disease. The first topic is mitral annular calcification, too common but too difficult to handle. And the second topic is bioprosthetic mitral valve dysfunction, structural degeneration. As you know, these are common topics. We at echocardiography, as clinical scientists, we come across this very so often. But we say, okay, it doesn't matter, it's just MAC, let's go. So today, the faculty of the virtual meeting today will decipher this for us. The faculty of the virtual meeting today are Professor Vijay Raghavan, who is not only a personal friend of mine for the last 35 years, but also a great clinical scientist and Dean postgraduate study at KIMS Trivandrum. He has spoken at all important fora in echocardiography all over the world. And his biodata is too difficult and too lengthy to handle, but I will say that anybody who remembers endomyocardial fibrosis will know that amongst the first papers that came out was from his lab in Trivandrum, and is still remembered. That the flutter of the anterior tricuspid leaflet is still very well remembered in the good old MO days. And Professor Vijay Raghavan will speak on mitral annular calcification, too common but too difficult to handle. The second faculty today is Dr. Rahul Malhotra, and we've traveled together for many years in life. He now works at Max Saket and also has a very important function is an important functionary in the Indian Academy of Echocardiography, because he's the general secretary, and we all know it is the general secretary who's actually the backbone of any organization as diverse as the Indian Academy, which is moving forwards at the right speed. I may just add that both speakers are elegant clinical scientists with scientific contributions in the best journals of the world. And it's been my pleasure and honor to be associated with them for many decades. We will also be joined by my colleague and Dr. Manish Bansal, who's just down to the operating room for some work, but he will be with us in no time at all. And Dr. Manish, has made important contributions and has been editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indian Academy of Echocardiography, former editor of Indian Heart Journal, and truly is clinical scientist and a very, very good researcher. So we are blessed in our department to have somebody who has grown up with this department. And he also naturally is a mentor to students undergoing training in DNB and echocardiography in our center. With these few words, ladies and gentlemen, let me first invite Professor Vijay Raghavan, my good friend, who will speak on mitral annular calcification, too common and too difficult to handle. Vijay, all yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ravi, my close friend, and the famous cardiologist. We've been standing with Professor S. Padmavati in the famous opening of the institute. I have great regard for Dr. Kashriwal, and he gave me this very interesting topic: mitral annular calcification, too common, too difficult to handle. For millennia, we knew that a calcification of the aortic valve because recent CT studies on mummies showed calcification of the mitral annulus. And we know that the mitral annulus is an accidental, incidental finding in the early 70s and 80s, in the early days of echocardiography. We used to pick up this calcium and never used to bother about it. We never thought this is a significant finding. In a large historical autopsy studies, MAC was seen in 10% of patients. CT scans, echocardiography, assessment of MAC without defining its severity reveal calcification 80 to 15% of patients without known CVD. The prevalence of MAC was 42% as the person grows up. So there is a growing phenomena by which aging indicates that there is a more chance of MAC appearing. Mitral annulus calcification is a chronic degenerative process, the fibrous base of the mitral valve. It initially thought to be an age-related degenerative process. There is accumulating evidence that other mechanisms, such as atherosclerosis, abnormal calcium phosphorus metabolism, also contribute to it. Every mechanism of atherosclerosis is involved in it. A chest X-ray might reveal calcification. Lateral projection of the X-ray is much better because the spine is moved away and the left hilum is also now not overlapping. And you can see in the chest X-ray the annular calcification with opening into the aortic LV outward tract. And when you do this echo, you have to be very careful. This is the same patient's echo taken about 10 minutes apart. This patient had not optimal gain settings. If you have optimal gain setting with myocardium imaged very well, valves, aortic and mitral valves, you find there is something which is shining brighter than the pericardium and the post-aortic wall. That is calcium. Calcium is defined as structures as brighter than the pericardium and the post-aortic wall, and that's how you identify. Two-dimensional echo is a technique to clearly demonstrate it. Severity was qualitatively determined by short axis view at the level of the mitral annulus as mild, focal, limited increase of echo density at the mitral annulus, moderate, marked echo density involving 1/3 to 1/2 of the ring circumference, or severe, marked echo density involving more than 1/2 the circumference of the ring, or with intrusion into the LV inflow tract. You may find the calcium extending even into the papillary muscles, creating a lot of problems in mitral valve replacement, mitral surgery. Maximal back thickness measured from the anterior to the posterior edge of its value creates greatest width is also used to assess max severity, a value more than 4 millimeter defining severe MAC. Some problem here. Here is you can see the minimal MAC and a severe MAC in the posterior annulus of the posterior mitral leaflet. It's the junctional point of the mitral leaflet with the annulus. Mitral annulus calcium occurs at the hinge point between the annulus and the posterior mitral leaflet. That movement must be creating a stress point at which this appears. It's a commonly observed chronic degenerative process of the base of the mitral valve. It's usually visualized by echocardiography as an echo-dense shelf-like structure, as I demonstrated, with an irregular, lumpy appearance involving the mitral valve annulus, very well seen to short axis view, with associated acoustic shadowing acoustic shadowing, and that is more so when the gain settings are not optimally placed. And it appears, as I said earlier, at the hinge point of the movement of the postmitral leaflet, where the maximum stress is there. Thickness greater than 1 millimeter, less than 4 millimeter has been considered mild to moderate, whereas thickness greater than 4 millimeter has been considered severe. MAC greater than 4 millimeter has been found to be an independent predictor of myocardial infarction and valvular heart disease. There are many other cardiac events which are related to mitral annular calcification, which I'll come to shortly. You can see in the 4-chamber view as well as in the 2-chamber view, and the amount of annular calcification that appears. Echocardiography is probably not an ideal method for detection of any kind of calcification in the heart because of its relatively low specificity in distinguishing between calcification and dense collagen. Cardiac CT is a useful tool to predict the extent and location of MAC and to quantify MAC objectively in order to assess the severity and associations with this entity. Quantification of MAC with sufficient reproducibility can also be performed using the Agatston method with calculation of calcification thickness at the mitral annulus. This is the computer tomography picture where you find there is a speck of calcium in the postmitral leaflet, base of the postmitral leaflet. There is no calcium here. The absence of mitral annular calcium, absolutely no calcium. And here you find there is dense calcification of the entire base of the postmitral leaflet. The dense calcification of the entire base of the postmitral leaflet. So it can extend from spot of calcification to heavy calcification of the entire base of the postmitral leaflet. It must be a degenerative age-related process, but we know that it is atherosclerosis, condition with increased mitral stress, like hypertension, aortic stenosis, and HCM makes the mitral MAC more common in these patients. There is recent work showing growth of the mitral calcification. This is taken over a 2-year progression of mitral calcification in 3 patients. This is one where you find it has grown from this size. It has grown from this size to this size, demonstrated by the PET scan also. From this size to this size in 2 years' time, and this size to this size. And please remember, it's a progressive manifestation. It's a progressive manifestation. This is the PET scan showing progressive manifestation of MAC. In this cohort, although MAC is characterized by increased local calcification activity and inflammation, baseline MAC burden was associated with the disease activity and the rate of subsequent progression. This suggests self-perpetuating cycle of calcification and inflammation that may be the target of future therapeutic interventions. Please remember, it's a live progressive phenomenon over a period of time. This is a short period of 2 years' time that the PET scan demonstrated growth and CT scan demonstrated growth of the MAC over a period of 2 years. There's been a lot of studies on MAC and cardiovascular disease. In a study of Foxtel showed 197 subjects over 16 years of follow-up in the Framingham Heart Study in multivariable adjustments for traditional cardiovascular risk factors. MAC was associated with an increased risk of incident CVD, cardiovascular death, and all-cause death. Attar found that MAC is associated with an increased prevalence of severe obstructive CAD. Some problem in possible explanation for these findings are that MAC may be a marker of atherosclerotic disease burden or that other unmeasured factors such as metabolic inflammatory, and hemostatic factors may be responsible for increased risk of CVD and mortality in patients with MAC. Just like we read about aortic valvular stenosis, you find that atherosclerosis extension must be a part of MAC mitral annular calcification. Interestingly, multi-ethnic study has shown that several cardiovascular risk factors are involving in the progression of MAC at the time of first detection and primary prediction. But please remember, MAC is not a site of location of infective endocarditis. And at present, as the guidelines goes by, no endocarditis prophylaxis is indicated in patients with isolated mitral annular calcification. Reversal of atherosclerosis having been tried and aortic stenosis have been tried using ACE inhibitors and statins. But aortic stenosis reversal has not been observed. In MAC also, we have never shown any reversal of MAC over a period of time. Rodriguez found that MAC is associated with increased risk of brain infarcts. But this association diminished after adjustment of potential confounders. Kieser found that the presence of MAC is a strong risk factor for stroke after adjustment for other predictors. Possible explanations for the association between MAC and clinical stroke may be derived from increased risk of carotid atherosclerosis, aortic atheroma, and atrial fibrillation among patients with MAC, and could even be calcium embolization. Generally, MAC and mitral disease, it has little or no effect on LV inflow or mitral function. Because unlike in rheumatic mitral involvement, there is usual sparing of the leaflet struck commissures in these patients. Now, I had examined 24,380 echocardiograms, found MAC to be present in 11.7% of patients with MR and without MR. Look at this. This patient had severe calcification of the mitral annulus extending into the leaflet, which impaired the dash-like operating of the mitral valve. Such phenomena may occur in annular calcium that occurs in patients with renal failure. Mitral stenosis due to annular calcification reported to be rare. Nonetheless, it was demonstrated that severe MAC could produce significant resting gradients. This process was seen in approximately 0.5% of the unselected outpatient echocardiograms and appeared to be mechanistically linked to restriction of intermittent leaflet motion also. Does it have any relation with arrhythmias? MAC have higher prevalence of atrioventricular block, bundle branch block, and interventricular conduction delay. Nair examined 104 patients with MAC and compared them with 121 matched control subjects. Conduction defects were found to be prevalent in 70% of patients with MAC versus 34% of control patients. The higher incidence of conduction disease may be partially due to direct extension of calcium deposits into the AV node and the bundle branches. Strong association between presence of MAC and AF have been found. This association is independent of baseline clinical risk factors for AF and of the development of interim myocardial infarction or heart failure. In a multivariate adjusted analysis of 1126 patients from the cohort of the Framingham Heart Study, MAC was associated with an increased risk of atrial fibrillation. How does MAC produce atrial fibrillation? Likely multifactorial, but appears to be partially mediated through left atrial enlargement. MAC might also interrupt the interatrial and intra-atrial conduction processes, leading to conduction system and atrial conduction defects, thus resulting in atrial fibrillation. The worst thing is the MAC poses significant challenges to the surgeon undertaking mitral replacement or repair. It is a contributing factor in cardiac rupture at the atrioventricular junction, in rupture of the LV free wall, and in injury of the circumflex artery and debridement of MAC is performed. Fusinich found that MAC to be present among 24% of patients referred for mitral surgery. MAC was associated with increased intraoperative conversion of valve repair to replacement. Have seen Some of the surgeons, it's olden days, when they try to excise the valve, they, because of the extension of the mitral calcification into the papillary muscle, it may even produce buttonhole of the heart, difficult to repair. One approach is to perform mitral replacement without annular calcium debridement, securing the prosthetic valve inside the calcified annulus. This approach may be complicated by periprosthetic leakage or by inability to replace an adequately sized prosthetic valve without some debridement. Another approach is to perform mitral edge-to-edge repair without annulus reconstruction. However, this can lead to unacceptable mitral gradients post-procedure. The main disadvantage in this technique is reduced durability, resulting in an increased risk of reoperation. The preferred approach to complete recalcification and reconstruction of mitral annulus is methods that have been evolved from the treatment of annular abscesses. In this approach, calcified annulus is dissected, followed by reconstruction, which can be achieved using annular suturing, an atrial flap, or an autologous pericardial patch. This technique is preferably followed by mitral repair or mitral replacement. MAC and mitral surgery is a very complicated phenomenon. Risks and benefits of surgery must be carefully assessed in patients with significant MAC, as increased surgical mortality has been observed in these patients. For those patients, the documented calcific emboli or repeated thromboembolism, despite anticoagulation, while replacement may be considered. Mitral replacement in the setting of severe MAC can complicate the situation by left ventricular rupture. MAC players reported unusual complications during mitral replacement in the presence of calcification of the annulus in 1970, as early as in 1971. In the perioperative period, patients developed acute postmicral infarction, ventricular aneurysm, or hemorrhage from the left ventricle. Spencer reported that the debridement of the calcified mitral annulus at the time of valve replacement or left ventricular repair. 2016 report showed that mitral annular calcification has prognostic implications in transcatheter atrial replacement. The 761 patients studied, 49% had MAC. Severe MAC was found to be an independent strong predictor of overall mortality following TAVR and cardiovascular mortality, as well as an independent strong predictor of new permanent pacemaker implantation after TAVR. So in TAVR also, mitral annular calcification does come in as an important factor in predicting future events. Carry home points are MAC has been noticed in old Egyptian mummies. MAC is commonly seen in the postmitral annulus. It is related to atherosclerosis with inflammation and degeneration at the base of the postmitral leaflet. Echocardiography can detect with careful adjustment of echo gate settings. CT scan is better method to delineate mitral calcium. MAC may complicate mitral surgery. MAC may increase morbidity, mortality of TAVR, as well as increased arrhythmogenicity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for patient hearing.
Thank you, Vijay. I think that was a wonderful exposition on mitral annular calcification. I thought that we could, if you agree, we could have the second session as well, and then have Q&A together, because some of the questions will be the same.
Yeah.
So then I would request Dr. Rahul Malhotra to actually take over now and speak on his topic on degenerative mitral prosthesis. Dr. Rahul, all yours, please.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, Dr. Raghavan. It's a very auspicious occasion today, and I'm very happy to note that I'm on this day of Guru Purnima, face to face with Dr. Kasliwal, with whom I've been working since last 20 years. Been a mentor, a teacher, a guide, directly, indirectly, in so many ways. Dr. Vijay Raghavan might not remember, but he was my examiner in my cardiology passing out exams. So here he is on the occasion of Guru Purnima in front of me. And Dr. Manish Bansal, with whom more of a colleague formally, but learned a lot and continue to learn from him in so many ways. So it's a very auspicious occasion when we are all together, and I'm grateful to Sir Dr. Kasliwal for giving me this opportunity, considering me worthy of being included in this sessions of Echo and Cardiology Medanta series. I'm allowed to share my screen. So I'll be speaking about bioprosthetic valve dysfunction, structural degeneration at the mitral position. So it's a very interesting topic, and as we are all aware of the different kinds of valve that we have been using for some time now, this is a useful classification. We've often seen this: mechanical valves and tissue valves. Mechanical valves, the obsolete ones are the ball and cage, while the recent ones is the double leaflet mechanical valve. While tissue valves are classified based on the source from which the tissues are retrieved. Xenografts are the most commonly used valves, while autografts the rarely used now, and same is the case with homografts, although some pediatric patients, they are still the procedures which are performed. And among xenografts, also we have the stented bioprosthesis, the stentless valve, and the sutureless valve, which is not used now, which came and went for the aortic position. And this is something which is coming up: tissue valves put inside a stent for transcutaneous valve surgeries. But the most commonly used biological heart valve are the stented prosthesis, which we'll be talking about throughout our discussion, because these are the commonest types of valves being used today. So valve replacement surgery remains the first line choice for valvular heart disease even now. More than 200,000 valve replacements occur, and it is likely to increase further by exceeding 850,000 annually by 2050. It is increasingly being preferred more to mechanical valves for reasons of ease of use, convenience, and no requirement of anticoagulation, which comes with a very heavy price of bleeding risk. And we've all seen the problems that our patients face with keeping the INR regulated and keeping the INR within check. And often, in spite of good INR controls, we'll end up into trouble with mechanical valves. But durability in terms of time, since implantation is improving by the day, and now we have data that the durability of the classic biological heart valves and the percutaneously implanted biological valves is almost similar now at the end of 5 and 10 years at the aortic position. But we do not have data as of now for the mitral position, and we're learning more and more the times to come. So there is a need to understand, predict, and prevent structural valve degeneration, which is the Achilles heel of biological valves. Other than this structural valve degeneration, they are the ideal valves to have in our body. And structural valve degeneration is what limits the extensive use of biological heart valves in younger patients also. So just a word about biological heart valves, particularly xenografts. We harvest them usually from pericardium of bovine and porcine, also sometimes equine sources. We sometimes have purely porcine aortic valve also, but it is only for the aortic position. Once retrieved, the pericardium from these animals is treated extensively to reduce its immunogenicity, as well as with the detergents, which is called the process of fixation. And the most commonly used chemical is glutaraldehyde. It is important for us to know this because, as we'll see later on, this is primarily responsible for the structural valve degeneration that we see. So the advantages, as I mentioned, are clearly almost normal hemodynamics with these valves and no requirement of anticoagulation. But the major disadvantage is structural valve degeneration, which is for the topic for the day and which I'll be talking about later on. So structural valve degeneration is an inevitable and an irreversible consequence of using a biological heart valve. Usually is manifested at 7 to 8 years post implant, more commonly seen with xenografts because of the animals being remotely related to us genetically, less often seen with homografts, and almost not seen with autografts. Most important factor is age. As the age of the patient increases, the chances of as the patient is age of the surgery increases, and the more time the biological heart valve is in our body, greater are the chances of structural valve degeneration. And as we can see, redo surgery rates, which is the defining endpoint of the structural valve degeneration, where it is so severe that we can do nothing except remove the valve. The redo surgery rates are around 10% at the end of 10 years and almost 30% at the end of 15 years. So 3 times in just 5 years. So this is an inevitable consequence of more duration the valve remains in our body. Younger ages patients, it is lesser. Other risk factors are also known, like hypertension, diabetes, patients with end-stage renal disease. So I was showing the slides of calcification being higher in certain populations. So same risk factors operate for structural valve degeneration also, and some rare entities like hyperparathyroidism. Besides prosthesis, patient mismatch is also a factor. If a smaller valve is put instead of a appropriately sized valve, it is likely to degenerate faster, and these rates are likely to be much higher if ppm is not taken into account. So when we talk of structural valve degeneration, all these terminologies are included. Degeneration includes formation of fibrosis, thickening of the valve cusps, leading ultimately to calcification, sometimes pannus formation, which is also an exuberant growth of connective tissue. It is a healthy tissue up to some stage whenever a foreign body is implanted, including a valve at the site of valve ring and the host tissue. Some amount of connective tissue formation is required, but once it becomes exuberant and protrudes into the lumen, it is known as pannus, and then it becomes dysfunctional. These changes can make the leaflets stiff and further result in delamination of the connective tissue. Sometimes the leaflets are sheared and become very thin, leading to even perforations and ruptures of the leaflets. Thrombosis is not believed to be commonly seen with biological valves, but this is a myth. We are increasingly finding more and more thrombosis occurring, and sometimes it is seen with biological heart valves also if we are looking for it. So it is obviously more common with mechanical heart valves, but it is also known to occur with biological heart valves. So all these entities put together are labeled as structural valve degeneration, SVD. So there's a lot of understanding which we has evolved over the last few years, and we know a lot now because SVD remains the Achilles heel of BHV durability. If we can somehow surmount this problem of degeneration, then we can have a very long-lasting biological heart valve, and which will be a wonderful tool to have because they are hemodynamically very good valves to put in any patient. So the earlier belief was that it is a simply wear and tear related to time, and it's a passive physicochemical phenomena. But now we are understanding that a lot of active processes like inflammation, immune responses are also responsible for causing structural valve degeneration. So dystrophic calcification or calcification due to recipient factors is also well-known factor, because dystrophic calcification is earlier believed to be the sole cause of SVD. Calcification occurring in collagen and elastin tissues, which have been disrupted by the process of pre-treatment that we discussed. And during this process, the collagen fibers are disturbed. They expose certain pockets which are otherwise not prone to calcification. But after this treatment, these pockets are exposed and hydroxyapatite crystals get deposited, and the process of calcification starts. Further, there is also evidence that once degeneration starts or any mechanical injury to this valve starts, although it is an acellular, almost acellular structure, some perfusion of red blood cells does occur, which invites with the iron gets oxidized and further invites the process of calcification. Similarly, some injury to these tissues also invites monocytes from circulation to enter and start the process of ingestion and apoptosis of these debris, and ultimately release harmful chemicals which end up processing further calcification. Certain proteins in the body once deficient, for example, this particular protein, when it is deficient in some individual, it is an anti-calcification protein which we have. If it is deficient, then these people are prone to more aggressive and more earlier calcification, even in early stages post-implant calcification occurs, along with other diseases which are prone to causing higher degrees of calcification like hyperparathyroidism and end-stage kidney diseases. Mechanical wear and tear, as we all know, is definitely a factor. For example, a simple tissue valve undergoes 600 million cycles of opening and closing over a period of 15 years. Such a rugged movement is definitely going to be detrimental to this very thin tissue that we have implanted in these patients. And further, this results in abnormal load. So whatever we may do, we can never replace the normal valves. If we see in this diagram, this hemodynamic load is very well absorbed by the normal design by the Almighty of our valves. But an artificially valve, even though they have very good hemodynamic profile, but the pressure and the flow dynamics are not exactly similar. So pressures and forces are not absorbed, and they do end up causing some amount of injury over a period of time. Besides, we do not have the three-layered structure that is present in the normal valve leaflets, which is very useful in remodeling in response to injury. And we are ending up putting just a dead tissue which is passively battling the excessive forces to which it is exposed to. So over a period of time, this does bear into significant injury. But this is not the end of the story. We are now understanding that active immune responses with the activation of innate immunity to foreign body, because these after all are harvested from remotely related animals to us, is resulting in activation of an immune response and an immune response mediated injury, which further aggravates the process. We also have now evidence that the process is similar to atherosclerosis in some scenarios, and we've even tried using statins to delay the onset of structural valve degeneration, although it was not fruitful, because some amount of cellular material from the donor cells does remain in these valves, which is responsible for giving rise to the immunogenicity, as well as some oxidation and of the lipids does occur, which gives rise to formation of foam cells, and a structure similar to a calcified plaque is also being seen on histopathology studies of these degenerated valves. So this was about pathophysiology of structural valve degeneration. How to diagnose. After valve surgery, history is a very important factor. Deteriorating symptoms, particularly a few years after implantation of biological heart valves, then we anticipate valve deterioration. We should be careful about suspecting it. Appearance of new murmurs in terms of physical examination. Hemolytic anemia in a patient who after valve surgery may indicate that there may be a paravalvular regurgitation causing excessive hemolysis, which may be responsible in a biological heart valve, although this is less commonly seen with BHVs as compared to mechanical heart valves. So when it is present in presence of a biological heart valve patient, we should always suspect a paravalvular leak or a processus patient mismatch, where a smaller valve is responsible for more injury to the inflow of blood. At the bottom of the screen is the most important investigation for picking up structural valve degeneration, which is echocardiography. CT, MRI, fluoroscopy are used in valvular heart disease, but hardly ever in routine practice in biological heart valve, and more useful in mechanical heart valve. Very rarely when there is some conflict and we are not able to resolve that in spite of our expert echocardiographic images. So echocardiography is the backbone of evaluation of valvular heart disease patients, and a PHV evaluation by echocardiography. Sure, we are all aware of these requirements, but I'll just go through them once again. Always have an essential background check. What is the age of the patient, age when the surgery for valve was done. Gender, body surface area is very important for deciding about the effective orifice area, index to body surface area for all our valvular heart disease patients. What is the heart rate, rhythm, blood pressure at the time of investigation? What are the comorbid conditions, as we just saw, like hypertension, diabetes, hyperparathyroidism, all associated with rapid degeneration of structural valves. PTINR is an important factor for mechanical heart valves, but not so much for biological heart valves, only useful in the first 3 months of biological heart valves, and we are also supposed to give anticoagulation to our patients. Very importantly, we should be aware of the exact OT notes. If they are possible, we should always look at the OT notes. What was the type of valve chosen? Exact branding should be known to us. What type, what size, exactly date of surgery. If possible, we should always look for the original documents related to the surgery of the valve. They are very useful in serial follow-ups. The other important report is the previous echo reports, because serial echocardiograms are the best way of tracking a patient for structural valve degeneration. Related to transthoracic and transesophageal echocardiography, a few caveats. Should all be aware of the immense utility of echocardiography in almost completely resolving the issue of prosthesis valve malfunction. Transthoracic or transesophageal, often in case of valve abnormality, when there's anything abnormal in transthoracic echo, TE should always be resorted to. There has to be a systematic approach to doing an echo in a patient with valvular heart disease. It should always include a 2D examination, Doppler, and wherever available, 3D echocardiography. Valvular heart disease has its own problems related to evaluation by echo, like shadow and reverberation artifacts, and because of which we are not able to clearly visualize. Even large regurgitant jets may sometimes be missed because of the large shadow of the valve, which masks the regurgitation depth. And of course, all the chambers upstream and downstream should always be evaluated in any given patient. Coming to the position mitral valve, which we are discussing today, when we are doing 2D echo of these patients, we should be aware, look carefully towards the movement of the prosthesis as a whole, whether it is okay or there is indication towards instability of the valve because of impending dehiscence of the valve. The type of valve, once if we do not have the OT notes, we should correlate with what we are seeing on the echo image. Carefully look at the leaflets for thickening, mobility. Struts, we have come across patients with broken struts once in our practice, so we should always look at the struts, all the leaflets. Careful evaluation of seeing ring. Sometimes the sutures and pledgets are very prominently seen and they may confuse us with presence of a vegetation. They should be noted in their position, and always look for mobile thrombus or a pannus, as I mentioned early on, along with other routine measurements that need to be taken. This is a cartoon showing the artifacts of shadow artifact. For example, in a transthoracic parasternal window, areas of left atrium will not be visible. Similarly, large areas of left atrium will not be visible because of the shadow artifacts. So whenever there is doubt, multiple windows should always be resorted to, multiple angles, off angle views should always be taken, and if doubt remains, then transesophageal echo is the best for looking at left atrium as well as mitral valve. For Doppler evaluation, these are certain mandatory requirements we should always do in all our patients. Transvalvular peak, early velocity using the continuous wave Doppler, the mean gradient, pressure half time, left ventricular outflow tract VTI will come to the utility later on, not only for the Doppler velocity integral, but also for orifice area calculation, because it is never to be done by the PHT method in prosthetic heart valve patients. It is always using this equation. RVSP is always important in patients with mitral valve disease. We should always, whenever we look at regurgitation of a prosthetic heart valve, differentiate a jet which is coming from within the valve ring to one which is outside the valve ring, which means it is a paravalvular regurgitation. The other thing is to quantify exactly in terms of its severity of regurgitation. These are the basics we are all aware of. And whenever there is a patient with fibrillation, we should always average out, use the correct sweep speed whenever we are doing a routine evaluation. If the heart rate is not appropriate, then the sweep speed needs to be adjusted. One thing which very commonly we see is, because surgeons are also seeing the patients of prosthetic valves, and the only parameter is very popularly known to them is the mean gradients. So this is something we should be aware of, and high early velocity and mitral gradients at PHV mitral position does not always mean abnormal. High gradients can be seen in hyperdynamic circulatory states like patients with anemia, thyrotoxicosis. We all know these conditions. Tachycardia because of any reason. Prosthesis patient mismatch. If a small size valve has been put in a large body surface area patient, then we will always get higher gradients and higher velocity. True stenosis will also produce higher gradients. Associated regurgitation, if it is there, will also produce higher gradients. However, in presence of atrial dysfunction, left atrial myopathy, and in presence of atrial fibrillation, in spite of significant stenosis, we may not get high gradients and high velocity. So gradients and high velocity is not the beginning and end of valve dysfunction at the mitral positions. So gradients alone are never to be relied upon either ways. A normal gradient is not normal always, and an abnormal gradient is always not indicating an abnormality. So this is why I mentioned we should always have these charts available in our labs, which have been provided for most of the valves. What should be the expected peak gradient with a given prosthesis according to its size, and what is the peak velocity that we expect. Effective orifice area for that particular size and that particular brand's valve is to be compared to what we are getting in our labs, and then we can arrive at a diagnosis of normality versus abnormality. So these are available from the 2009 GAZE guidelines. It is a good practice to keep these charts in our lab and compare the EOA and the gradients with the particular size and type of valve before we commit ourselves to an abnormal situation. So this chart, although looks busy, is quite simple. I'll just mention the importance of peak velocity and gradient. Higher than 2.5 and 10 indicate abnormality, suggestive of significant stenosis, but we should always have the VTI ratio at the prosthetic valve along with the VTI ratio at LV outflow tract if there is no regurgitation at the aortic position. And then if it is also high, more than 2.5, and effective orifice area in general for all valves, if less than 1, indicates significant stenosis in these positions. Pressure half time alone should be used, but pressure half time using the formula that we use in native valve disease should not be used. So if our parameters are falling in this range, and if there is no other reason to suspect higher velocities and gradients, then definitely further evaluation should be done for possible valve stenosis due to structural valve degeneration in these patients. So enough of theoretical slides. Now let us look at some echo images, which are always wonderful to look at. Oh, for some reason these are not moving. I'm sorry. So this was a patient with structural valve degeneration, very thickened leaflets and almost immobile leaflets here, and patient also having atrial fibrillation, dense sec in left atrium, and we could see that the gradients are, mean gradient is around 10 in one beat, 17 in other beat, average was also more than 10. Three-dimensional echo from the LA side was clearly suggestive of significant valve thickening and stenosis. Hardly opening orifice was seen in this, while on this LV perspective of the 3D valve also we could see all the three struts and hardly opening valve. But when we looked at the Doppler parameters, also all the necessary Doppler parameters taken, LVOT diameter, LVOT velocity time integral, and the VTI at the prosthesis location, and we arrived at the EOA. It was much less than 1. It was around 0.6 in this particular patient. Even index to body surface area, it remained quite low. So this was a clear demonstration of structural valve degeneration leading to valve stenosis, and this patient had come to us around 10 years after his biological heart valve replacement at the mitral position. In a patient of valve regurgitation also, the classification is more or less same as we use in native valve disease for mild, moderate, and severe regurgitation. Similar parameters are used, the subjective parameters, although the quantitative parameters are also similar that we have for the native valve disease, but they have not been validated so well for the prosthetic valve, particularly for the mitral position, and separately for the tissue valve, there's hardly any data, but we continue to use them, the same parameters, and if we are getting most of the parameters in abnormal range, if a regurgitant jet is large, central, more than 8 centimeters square, occupying more than 40% of LA area, along with dilatation of left ventricle and left atrium, prosthetic heart valve also structurally appears abnormal, and the continuous wave jet is as dense as the forward jet, along with a shape which is like a dagger, early peaking triangular. And it is very suggestive of a severe valvular regurgitation. For paravalvular regurgitation, also the criteria are similar, but slightly different parameters have been proposed where we look at the valve jets coming from outside the valve ring, then it is supposed to mean that the patient has paravalvular regurgitation, and a different classification has been proposed for that. Apologize for the slides not moving, but this was a patient with completely flail leaflets and resulting in a large regurgitant jet at the tissue position almost 15 years after his surgery. This was a 75 years old male post MVR in 2011, progressively worsening dyspnea leading to orthopnea in the last 1 month. This was because of a flail leaflet. One of the leaflets was completely flail, and this we could demonstrate on his three-dimensional echo also. So these are examples of different degrees of MR, not visible in the moving clip. There is no MR seen, there is mild MR, and there was severe MR filling almost the entire left atrium in this particular patient. But we should be aware of the fact of acoustic shadowing whenever we are evaluating MR, because we may not be seeing the entire jet if we are using transthoracic echo window. So immediately should resort to transesophageal echo wherever we realize that there could be a significant MR in this patient, which will not be visible from the apical and other windows because of the acoustic shadowing. So multiple views and comprehensive evaluation should always be resorted to in these scenarios. A word about thrombus and pannus, which also can be seen with biological heart valves at the mitral position. Thrombus is traditionally known to be large, mobile, having independent motion to the valve, usually irregular in shape, projecting towards the LA side, can form any time after the valve surgery, a strong association with the degree of anticoagulation, but it is not so much applicable to biological heart valve. A thrombus in biological heart valve sometimes forms over a pannus also. So pannus and thrombus both can co-occur, and its echo density is similar to the echo density of myocardium. While pannus is usually a small shelf-like ingrowth from the annular ring growing inwards in the plane of the valve, it is much more echodense, more bright, because it is full of fibrous tissue rather than platelets, and it is more commonly seen at aortic position, but also known to occur at mitral position with the biological heart valve. So all efforts should be made to differentiate between pannus and thrombus echocardiographically based on history, based on appearance, based on the background of the patient. But if it is not possible, sometimes both pannus and thrombus may also co-occur, and it may not always be possible to pinpoint whether the cause is a thrombus or a pannus. So coming to the management of structural valve degeneration, the mainstay of treatment after severe structural valve degeneration has been a redo valve surgery. And sometimes when we are only troubled because of the presence of a thrombus which is causing platelet valve dysfunction, then thrombolysis can be useful even in biological heart valve. And now this new technique, now there's the transcutaneous valve in valve procedure, is also coming up on the scene, which has changed the scenario of biological heart valve, where we do not have the option of patients undergoing a very risky redo valve surgery. Transcutaneous valve in valve procedure has been found to be very useful. So these were the images of a patient where we had significant MR flail leaflet after the biological heart valve implantation. Patient was a high risk candidate for surgery, more than 10% STS score for mortality. Patient underwent a valve in valve procedure. These are the steps, entirely guided by three-dimensional echocardiography, from septal puncture to guiding the dilatation step leading the catheters through the valve. This is the inflation of the balloon, very nicely seen even by 2D echo in the valve, and then finally leaving the valve in place, entirely guided by three-dimensional echo procedure. So this is the appearance of the tissue valve in 2D echo, in color Doppler. No regurgitation was there after the procedure in this patient who ended up with severe regurgitation before this. And this is the appearance from the LA perspective, appearance from the LB perspective, valve in valve. Very sorry for the lack of running images. So in terms of prevention, a lot of thought has been going, and a lot of research going on in biomedical engineering in terms of obviating this problem of structural valve degeneration, which is, as I mentioned, the Achilles heel of this situation. If we are able to overcome this problem, then we have an ideal, almost ideal scenario for our patients with valvular heart disease. So not only important is the good surgical skill, ensuring that the valves are handled properly during surgery, they are not injured during surgery, which may be a cause for degeneration, and appropriate selection of patient sizing according to the patient's body size, very important for preventing PPM and shortened lifespan of the valves in these patients. The other things are going on in the biomedical labs the world, like improved valve design to ensure less shear stress to the leaflets. Novel linking agents other than glutaraldehyde, which is commonly used, are being looked at so that minimum injury can be left, minimum cellular material from the host can be left into the donor valve, and it becomes very less immunogenic. So all these steps are being taken so that better and better valve design which lasts longer and longer can be revised. We have looked at immunosuppressive therapy also, but it has not really worked so well till now. So to summarize, the biological heart valve continues to increase, and the projected rise we discussed right at the outset. But structural valve disease remains an inevitable and irreversible process in all patients with biological heart valve. We need to circumvent this problem, but it is a very complex and multifactorial process, a combination of passive and active mechanisms. But systematic and serial echocardiography done, particularly after a patient is suspected to have BHV, say 5 to 10 years post valve surgery, when BHV, all patients with BHV are likely to have SVD present to varying degrees, is very important when we suspect this problem and evaluate it appropriately by echo. For mitral position, transesophageal echo is a preferred modality whenever we suspect any problem. TE should be resorted to for various reasons discussed early on. While improved designs of the valve, better anti-calcification and decellularization techniques in the designing of the valve are likely to result in improved durability in the times to come. Statins have been tried, anti-inflammatory drugs, immunosuppressive agents have been tried to bypass the active processes, but none of the trials have been successful, and there is no FDA recommendation for any of these drugs for preventing structural valve degeneration as of now. But hopefully in the future we will have valves from genetically engineered animals, further their tissues being treated in vitro with the host cells. So almost autograft like valves can be prepared in these genetically engineered animals, but this seems like a far-fetched dream as of now. For now, once structural valve degeneration has reached severe proportions, thrombolysis sometimes for thrombus, redo surgery, and now transcutaneous mitral valve-in-valve procedure remains the treatment option for all our patients with these problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. So this was a fabulous discourse on mitral annular calcification and bioprosthetic mitral valve dysfunction. I thank both of you, gentlemen, for a phenomenal job. Dr. Vijay Raghavan took us from the days of Tutankhamun from Egypt to the present time, and very clearly demonstrated that MAC can be mild, moderate, and severe. It is progressive, and he quoted the MESA study and the Framingham studies, which are both relevant in this field. In the current scenario, when in our own country TAVR is becoming so important, he did point out that this may be an indicator that of higher mortality and sometimes of pacemaker implantation in TAVR patients. Also, the presence of MAC sometimes can be used as a pointer towards, is a risk factor for myocardial infarction. Dr. Rahul's talk was, and it was like a chapter out of a book, very well demonstrated bioprosthetic mitral valve dysfunction. He started with the normal valves, and really I was amazed that a small valve beats 600 million times, opens and closes in 15 years. I mean, why should it not degenerate? That is the important thing. So you really brought it out very well. And that this is not atherosclerosis, but it's actually inflammation. So I'll throw open these two very important and well spoken talks to the attendees. But before I do that, I have Dr. Manish Bansal, who has just joined us after doing a TE, and maybe he would like to say a few words before we take the Q&A.
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, Sir Dr. Vijay Raghavan and Dr. Rahul. Actually, I missed Dr. Vijay Raghavan's talk, so I cannot comment on that. But Dr. Rahul's presentation was a very comprehensive disposition on bioprosthetic valve degeneration. So it was a wonderful talk. That's all I can say. Covered almost everything related to this topic.
Vijay, before anybody asks a question, I wanted to ask you that, we all go to the cath labs when the towers are being implanted. Is anybody really paying attention to back at that point?
Pardon?
How important is the presence of MAC, mild, moderate, severe, or severe MAC in implantation of TAVR?
Yeah. See, just said the severe MAC has a direct influence on morbidity and mortality of percutaneous aortic valve replacement, because the central fibrous body is close by,
Right.
and the annular calcification can extend and get involved, and number one, trigger atrial fibrillation, two, atrioventricular blocks, and these are things which can complicate the issue. It has been demonstrated that there is a direct relationship between presence of significant calcium and results of TAVR.
Vijay, in the same context, Dr. Weber was asked a question that is there any criteria for grading MAC on echo quantitatively? You did mention, he says, about MAC gradient that it's more than 4 millimeters. It's severe, but is there anything else? Is there anything more to it?
See, what is done is short axis view. I shown the short axis view, and then thickness of the calcium. Thickness of the calcium less than 2 is mild, 2 to 4 is moderate, more than 4 is severe mitral answer calcification. Everything depends upon the thickness of the calcium at that particular point, unfortunately, not the extent around the rib. But we know very well, extents to the calcium around the rib is an equally important factor in deciding on the prognosis of the patient and development of atrial fibrillation, AV gradients, and other complications.
Vijay, if we pick up MAC in a younger individual, I mean, if we start a study like that, do you think agents like statins will actually be found, because there's a lot of work on valvular aortic stenosis, that how can we stop sclerosis from becoming stenotic by the use of weight control, hypertension control, use of statins, diabetes under control. Is there something like this going on in this field? Because people are helpless. They just overlook MAC. That's what's happening.
Earlier, there is a concept that because this is an extension of atherosclerosis, high dose statins may reverse it or arrest it. But that concept was disproved over a period of time by following up these patients on statins as well or on ACE inhibitors. Same thing with annular calcification. Annular calcification is a progressive phenomena, as demonstrated by the PET scan. It's a progressive phenomena which cannot be reduced or prevented by ACE inhibitors or statins. It just perpetually progresses depending upon the stress and strain at the valve to the annulus junction, depending on systemic hypertension, aortic stenosis, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, all those things which increase the stress at that particular point induces more and more calcium to be deposited. And the PET study showed that it's not only calcium, there is an inflammatory response which attracts calcium to that particular point in annular calcification.
Right. Dr. Rahul, one question came up that what is the, one would expect atrial fibrillation to be derogatory for, or would cause early dysfunction to a bioprosthetic mitral valve, or any valve for that matter. What is your comment on that? Because otherwise also atrial fibrillation is becoming a pandemic. And people who have a bioprosthetic mitral valve always rue the fact that they got the valve that they would not have to take anticoagulants. And now we are saying that, look, you have this, and so you have to do it. So what do you think? AF is causing a lot of issues to these patients?
The AF does cause a lot of issues to these patients because ultimately they were given a prosthetic valve for avoiding the need of anticoagulation. But now,
Right.
for anticoagulation, the advantage of biological heart valve is taken away.
Right.
AF per se is not detrimental to the tissue valve as such, though the evaluation of tissue valve because of AF becomes problematic, as it does with most of other diseases.
Okay, so are there any?
Question.
No, same question.
Yeah, I want to ask one question. to sir.
Please, doctor.
So my question is related to MAC. So patients who develop MAC are usually elderly. They have the same cardiovascular risk factors. They have LVH also many times. So often it becomes difficult to determine whether dyspnea in such a patient is because of mitral inflow obstruction or because of LVH and LV diastolic dysfunction. Is there a way by which we could differentiate this in clinical practice and determine what is causing dyspnea in a patient so that we could treat it accordingly?
The presence of mitral gradient is done only by an echocardiography.
Yeah.
But it is very well known that MAC patients have a higher incidence of atrial fibrillation. This is in relation to left atrial dimension. And left atrial dimension, especially MAC extending into the posterior LA wall, could interrupt the intra-atrial conducting system and fragment the pacemaker impulses and produce atrial fibrillation. So these are the things that are coming in relation to the what was the question? I forgot.
So my question was how can we differentiate diastolic dysfunction related symptoms versus
No. See, the stenotic picture across the mitral valve is a very definite phenomenon in Doppler echocardiography. We can definitely differentiate a mitral stenosis from a diastolic dysfunction. Mitral stenosis is diagnosed by end diastolic gradient and pan diastolic gradient and reduction of ES slope. All the three are present in mitral stenosis, but diastolic dysfunction is radically different.
So I think we've had a fabulous disposition from both of you. Very comprehensive, very well presented, and there was a lot to learn. Actually, we deal with these things every day, but the way both of you have put it in such good perspective that we will be looking at these conditions differently from tomorrow. So thank you very much, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
And all of you have supported me and Manish in our Medanta Echo and Cardiology today and tomorrow. We remain, both of us, indebted for this. And hopefully, next month we'll meet again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Manish.
Thank you.
Okay, then bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, sir.